Silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's a warning. It doesn't arrive dramatically. It's a weekend with no plans. A phone that hasn't buzzed all day. A birthday that passes quietly. Scrolling through your contacts and realizing there isn't one person you feel comfortable calling just to talk. And at first you internalize it. Maybe you didn't try hard enough. Maybe you should have reached out more. Maybe this is just what happens when you fall behind socially. You start asking yourself, is it me? Am I broken? Is everyone else connected while I drift? But what if this isolation isn't a glitch in your personality? What if it's structural, because something is happening right now that almost no one is talking about? Millions of men are slowly fading from the social landscape, not loudly, not rebelliously, just disappearing. That's not solitude, that's erasure. Today we're dissecting something that hides in plain sight. People call it the male loneliness epidemic, but even that phrase is misleading. An epidemic sounds like a disease, like something that just happened. What we're looking at isn't random, it's structural. Yes, the data is real. The Gallup numbers, the friendship recession, the sharp rise in men reporting daily loneliness. But statistics don't explain why this crisis feels invisible. To understand that, we need to examine two psychological mechanisms operating beneath the surface. The first is the empathy gap, the way society's emotional radar is calibrated to detect distress in women faster than it detects it in men. The second is what's often called the disposable male hypothesis, the historical and sociological framework that ties a man's value to what he provides, not who he is. Together, these forces create something dangerous. They don't just produce loneliness, they normalize it. They make male isolation look ordinary, expected, even deserved. This is not a call for pity, it's not a complaint, it's an analysis. Because the man who understands the structure stops blaming himself for a systemic pattern. He stops asking, what's wrong with me? And starts asking, what am I standing inside of? Not for validation, for clarity. And clarity is survival. Section 1. The statistical reality. Let's establish the baseline. Loneliness is no longer an exception. For a growing number of men, it is the default setting. According to recent Gallup data, roughly 1 in 4 men between the ages of 15 and 34 report feeling lonely on a daily basis. Not occasionally, not during a rough season, daily. That means millions of young men wake up each morning carrying a quiet, persistent sense of disconnection from the world around them. And that's just the feeling. Now look at the infrastructure. 30 years ago, it was uncommon for a man to report having 0 close friends. Today, that number has multiplied dramatically. Around 20% of men now say they have no close friends at all. None. No one to call during a crisis. No one to celebrate with. No one who knows what is actually happening in their inner world. That isn't independence, that's social malnutrition. Men are also significantly less likely than women to receive emotional support from friends. Less likely to express affection. Less likely to say I'm struggling without cushioning it in humor. Over time, this compounds. Emotional isolation becomes normalized. Silence becomes routine. When you remove consistent connection from a social species, the consequences are predictable. Motivation declines, risk tolerance shifts, resilience erodes, creativity narrows. The nervous system adapts to isolation the way a body adapts to chronic stress. Yet the dominant narrative frames this as a motivation problem. We're told men just need to open up more, reach out more, try harder. But when 20% of a demographic reports having no close friendships, we are no longer looking at individual laziness. We are looking at environmental failure. Something in the structure is corroding male bonds. Community has been replaced with competition, brotherhood with performance, shared struggle with curated image. We are more digitally connected than any generation in history, yet structurally more alone. If you feel like you're drifting while everyone else seems anchored, understand this. You are not observing a personal defect. You are observing a pattern, and patterns are never accidental. This is the baseline. Now we need to understand why it continues unchecked. Section 2. The empathy gap. Onto the data is this clear, the obvious question is simple. Why does nothing seem to happen? When a demographic shows measurable psychological decline, there is usually urgency, campaigns, funding, cultural conversation. Yet when it comes to male loneliness, the response is muted, often dismissive, sometimes mocking. This is where the empathy gap enters the discussion. For decades, psychological research has shown that women tend to score higher than men on self-reported empathy measures. Surveys like the Interpersonal Reactivity Index consistently reflect that difference. From that data, a cultural assumption formed. Women are naturally more empathetic, men are naturally less emotionally aware, but self-reporting is not the same as neurological capacity. When researchers measure automatic brain responses using EEG or fMRI scans, the gap narrows dramatically. In many cases, it disappears. The male brain registers another person's pain just as quickly as the female brain does. The hardware is comparable, so what explains the real-world difference? Conditioning. Empathy has two layers, capacity and permission. The capacity may be equal, the permission is not. Boys are often trained early to suppress outward displays of vulnerability. Shake it off. Don't cry. Be strong. Over time, suppression becomes identity. Emotional restraint becomes proof of competence. Meanwhile, girls are more often encouraged to articulate feelings, to notice relational shifts, to maintain emotional networks. Amplification becomes normalized, but the empathy gap is not only about how men give empathy, it is about how men receive it. Culturally, male distress is filtered through a different lens. When a man struggles, the reflex response is often solution-oriented. Fix it, improve yourself, compete harder, go to the gym, get a hobby. Those suggestions are not malicious, they are reflexive, but they are not empathy. Empathy sits with discomfort, troubleshooting attempts to eliminate it. When a man expresses loneliness and receives strategy instead of understanding, the signal is clear: your pain is a problem to solve, not a state to witness. After enough repetitions, he learns something dangerous. Expression does not bring relief, it brings evaluation. So he adapts, he minimizes, he jokes, he withdraws, he performs stability. From the outside, he looks fine, functional, calm, and the absence of visible breakdown reinforces the cultural belief that men are less affected. This creates a feedback distortion. Male pain becomes harder to detect, not because it is smaller, but because it is quieter, not because people are cruel, but because the radar was calibrated differently, and what the radar does not detect, it does not respond to. Section 3. The disposable male. To understand why male distress so often goes unnoticed, we have to examine something deeper than culture. We have to examine utility. Throughout history, societies have depended heavily on male risk. Men hunted large game. Men fought wars. Men built infrastructure in dangerous conditions. Men entered mines, crossed oceans, and took on the kinds of physical risk that preserved or expanded the tribe. This pattern was not random. It emerged from biological realities. Reproduction places a heavier physical investment on women. Pregnancy is time-intensive and biologically limited. From a purely survival standpoint, populations can recover numerically, with fewer men more easily than with fewer women. Over time, that arithmetic shaped social expectations. Men became associated with expendability in high-risk roles. That expendability was rarely framed negatively. It was framed as honor, as courage, as duty. But beneath the narrative of glory sat a structural truth. Male value became tied to function. A man was respected for what he could endure, build, protect, or provide. That association never fully disappeared. It evolved. In the modern world, most men are not hunting mammoths or storming battlefields, but the psychological script remains. Worth is still measured in output, income, status, competence, stability. A man who performs well within those metrics is visible. A man who falters often becomes peripheral. This is the foundation of what many call the disposable male hypothesis, the idea that male value is conditional, tied more tightly to utility than inherent existence. You can see it in subtle patterns. When men lose employment, their social networks often shrink. When status declines, invitations decrease. When productivity drops, respect can erode. Meanwhile, vulnerability without visible contribution is frequently interpreted as weakness rather than injury. Again, this is not about blame, it is about pattern recognition. If you are conditioned to believe your worth is transactional, you will internalize a quiet fear. If I stop producing, I stop mattering. That fear shapes behavior. It pushes men to overwork, to suppress doubt, to hide instability, to compete even when exhausted. It also makes loneliness uniquely threatening, because loneliness in a utility framework signals redundancy. If no one depends on you, needs you, or uses what you provide, the primitive alarm activates. Am I becoming irrelevant? This is not conscious most of the time. It sits lower, beneath language, but it influences identity formation from an early age. Boys are often praised for performance, for achievement, for problem solving, less frequently for emotional presence. Over decades, the message compounds. Be useful, be strong, do not become a burden. So when isolation sets in, it does not feel like a temporary emotional state. It feels like obsolescence. An obsolescence to a system built on utility feels dangerous. Understanding this does not require resentment, it requires clarity. Because once you see that the script exists, you can begin deciding which parts of it you are willing to keep. and which parts no longer serve you. Section 4. The utility trap. Once you understand the utility script, you start seeing the trap. From early childhood, many boys are rewarded for competence, win the game, solve the problem, carry the weight, stay composed. Achievement becomes identity. Capability becomes currency. I am valuable because I can do. That belief can drive discipline, ambition, and resilience. It can build careers and reputations. It can create external success, but it has a hidden cost. Connection is not built on performance. It is built on exposure. Real intimacy requires revealing uncertainty, admitting confusion, saying, "I don't know," saying, "I'm not okay." Those admissions feel dangerous inside a framework where value equals strength. So the performance continues. You become the reliable one, the calm one, the provider, the problem solver, the man who always has an answer. People respect you. They depend on you. They admire your stability. But admiration is not the same as closeness. Utility attracts transactions. It does not automatically create intimacy. If your identity is built entirely around being needed, you may find yourself surrounded yet unknown. People come to you for solutions, not understanding. They see what you provide, not what you feel. Over time, this creates a paradox. To be valued as a man, you are told to be self-sufficient, independent, unshakable. To be connected as a human, you must allow interdependence. You must risk vulnerability. Those two directives collide. The more you double down on usefulness, the less space you leave for need. And the less space you leave for need, the less opportunity there is for genuine bonding. So you work harder, improve more, optimize further. You assume connection will follow success. Sometimes it does, temporarily, but relationships built on utility remain conditional. When output drops, attention often shifts. That is the trap. If you build your identity solely on what you can produce, you create a life where people value your function but never truly meet you. And when the performance finally exhausts you, the silence waiting underneath can feel overwhelming. Not because you failed, but because no one ever learned who you were beyond the role. Section 5. The silent feedback loop. This is where everything converges. The empathy gap, the disposable male script, the utility trap. Together they create a self-reinforcing cycle, a loop that feeds on silence. It begins with distress. A man feels disconnected, restless, numb. He senses something is off, but he cannot immediately name it. The loneliness is subtle at first, more like background static than a sharp pain. Next, he scans the environment. Is it safe to speak? He looks at how male vulnerability is received. He sees advice offered quickly. He sees weakness corrected, not comforted. He sees other men masking, so he calculates. Better to stay quiet. That is the pivot point. Instead of expression, he performs stability. He jokes, he shrugs. He says he's tired, busy, focused. He channels discomfort into work, the gym, distractions, scrolling, anything that preserves the image of control. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. He shows up, he functions, he produces. And because there is no visible collapse, the world assumes there is no problem. The absence of visible distress reinforces the bias. Men are fine, men are strong, men don't need support. That perception becomes feedback. No one asks deeper questions. No one pushes past the surface. The silence is interpreted as strength. He sees that no help is coming, not because people hate him, but because the system reads performance as wellness. So he withdraws further. The circle tightens. Loneliness increases. Emotional range narrows. Motivation declines. He invests more heavily in productivity, because productivity is measurable. Emotions are not. Years can pass inside this loop. On paper, life looks stable. Inside, something erodes quietly. The most dangerous part of this cycle is not the pain itself. It is the normalization. When isolation becomes routine, it stops feeling urgent. It feels deserved. It feels like the natural consequence of adulthood. Breaking this loop does not begin with society changing. It begins with recognition. Recognizing that silence is not proof of strength, that functioning is not proof of connection, that self-containment is not the same as resilience. The moment a man questions the script, the loop weakens, because awareness disrupts repetition, and repetition is what kept him trapped. Conclusion: what we're witnessing is not a dramatic collapse. It's quiet, it's subtle, it's a slow erosion of connection disguised as independence. The data shows the pattern. The psychology explains the mechanism. The structure reveals the pressure points. Male loneliness is not simply about men refusing to talk. It is the predictable outcome of a system that rewards performance, conditions suppression, and measures worth in output. When you grow up believing you matter because of what you provide, You learn to hide the parts of yourself that cannot produce. Over time, that hiding becomes identity, and identity becomes isolation. But here is the critical shift. Understanding the structure removes the shame. If you recognize yourself somewhere in this pattern, that recognition is not weakness, it is awareness, and awareness is leverage. You cannot force society to recalibrate overnight. You cannot demand that the empathy gap closes tomorrow. Structural patterns change slowly, but you can reject the premise of your own disposability. You can question the belief that you are only valuable when you are useful. You can choose to build connections that are not transactional, conversations that are not strategic, friendships that are not competitive. That choice will feel uncomfortable at first. It may even feel risky, but clarity always does. The man who sees the script gains distance from it. The man who gains distance from it regains agency, and agency is the opposite of erasure. If this helped you see something you couldn't name before, subscribe. Not for noise, not for outrage, for clarity, because clarity is how you stop participating in your own disappearance.